"You're overreacting, Emily. Sophie did nothing wrong." That was the moment my husband chose her over me, standing right there in front of everyone like I was the problem, like I was the one who had imagined everything. And for a second the room went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels louder than shouting, every pair of eyes shifting between us, waiting to see if I'd break, if I'd cry, if I'd cause a scene like the dramatic wife he clearly wanted me to be, but I didn't. I just stood there, perfectly still, my hands relaxed at my sides, my heart steady in a way that would have surprised anyone who actually knew what had been happening behind the scenes. Because the truth was, by the time Daniel said those words, I already knew exactly how this was going to end. And it wasn't going to be in his favor, not even close, but he didn't know that yet, and neither did Sophie, who stood beside him with that carefully composed expression, the kind that tries to look innocent but is just a little too confident, a little too practiced, like she'd already imagined this moment playing out differently, maybe with me storming off and Daniel following her out like some kind of hero. Except that's not what happened, not even a little bit. And as I slowly looked around the room, taking in the familiar faces, the co-workers, the friends, the people who had watched our marriage from the outside and assumed it was solid, I realized something almost amusing. This was exactly where everything needed to unfold, exactly where Daniel had unknowingly walked into the worst decision of his life, because he thought this was just an argument, just another moment he could smooth over later with excuses and half-hearted apologies. But this wasn't that kind of situation anymore. And as I finally let a small, controlled smile form on my lips, I saw it. The flicker of confusion in his eyes, the first crack in his confidence, because I wasn't reacting the way he expected. I wasn't raising my voice, I wasn't asking questions, I wasn't even looking at him like he mattered. And that unsettled him more than anything I could have said, because Daniel Carter had always relied on control, on knowing exactly how things would play out, and for the first time he didn't. And Sophie shifted slightly beside him, her posture tightening just enough to give away that she felt it too, that something about this moment wasn't going according to whatever script they had imagined. And I let that silence stretch just a second longer before finally speaking, calm, steady, and completely certain, because while they both thought this was the moment I lost everything, the truth was much simpler, and much more satisfying. This was the moment they realized they had already lost it all. 2 weeks earlier, nothing about my life looked like it was falling apart, at least not from the outside. And that was exactly why Daniel thought he could get away with everything, because to everyone else we were the kind of couple people quietly envied, stable, successful, predictable in the best way, the kind of marriage that looked effortless after 10 years together, a house in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes outside the city, 2 reliable cars in the driveway, shared routines that had become almost automatic, and for a long time I believed in that version of us too, or at least I believed that whatever problems we had were normal, manageable, nothing that could not be fixed with time and honesty. But the first crack did not come from anything dramatic, it never does. It came from something so small it would have been easy to ignore if I had been the kind of person who avoided uncomfortable truths. It was a Thursday night around 8:30 and Daniel was sitting on the couch with his laptop open, supposedly finishing up some work, something he had been doing more often lately, staying up later, saying he had deadlines. And I remember pausing in the hallway because I heard him laugh, not the polite kind of laugh he used with coworkers or clients, but something softer, lighter, almost private. And when I walked into the living room, he closed his laptop just a little too quickly. Not completely, just enough to make it obvious he did not want me to see the screen. And when I asked who he was talking to, he did not even look at me when he said it was just a colleague, just a quick message about a project. And that should have been the end of it. That is what most people would have accepted, but something about the timing, the tone, the way he avoided eye contact, it stayed with me longer than it should have. And over the next few days I started noticing more things, the kind of details that seem insignificant on their own but become impossible to ignore when they start to form a pattern. He started bringing his phone with him everywhere, even to the kitchen when he was just grabbing a glass of water. He began turning the screen away from me without realizing it. And there were moments when he would step outside to take calls he used to have right in front of me, always with the same explanation, work, always work. And I told myself I was overthinking it, because that is what you do when you want to protect what you have. You give the other person the benefit of the doubt even when your instincts are telling you something is off. But then came the dinner, the one that made it impossible to keep pretending. We were out at a restaurant downtown, one of those places Daniel liked to pick when he wanted to show that everything was fine, that we were still us. And halfway through the meal his phone lit up on the table, just for a second, but long enough for me to see a name, Sophie, and I remember asking casually, trying to keep my voice even, who that was, and without hesitation, without even a pause, he said it was someone from work, new to the team, nothing important, and he flipped the phone over as if that explained everything. But it did not, because people do not hide things that are not important, and that was the moment something shifted inside me, not anger, not yet, but clarity, the kind that settles in quietly and refuses to leave. And instead of confronting him right there, instead of asking more questions he would just deflect, I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped reacting, I stopped asking, and I started paying attention, because if there was one thing I knew about Daniel, it was that he relied on assumptions. He assumed I would trust him without question. He assumed I would not look deeper, and most importantly, he assumed that whatever he was doing would stay hidden as long as he kept his explanations simple, and that was his first real mistake, because while he thought he was managing the situation, what he did not realize was that I had already begun putting the pieces together, quietly, carefully, and once I started, I did not miss a single detail. Once I made the decision to stop reacting and start observing, everything became clearer in a way that was almost unsettling, like adjusting your eyes to the dark and realizing the shapes around you were never what you thought they were. And the more I paid attention, the more obvious Daniel's pattern became, not because he was careless, but because he was consistent, and consistency is what exposes people when they think they are being clever. He left for work at the same time every morning, but now there were small delays, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, always explained with something simple like misplaced keys or an extra email he had to send, but those little delays started to align with something else, the timing of his messages, because even though he thought he was being discreet, he could not completely hide the rhythm of his attention shifting away from me, and I noticed that his phone would light up at almost predictable intervals, especially in the late evenings. And every time it did, his posture changed just slightly, his focus narrowing, his tone softening if he stepped away to answer. And I never asked about it again, not once, because asking would have given him the chance to adjust, to cover his tracks better. And what I needed was for him to keep believing I was unaware, so I let the silence do the work for me, and in that silence, I started building something much more valuable than suspicion. I started building certainty. And then came the first real confirmation, not from anything dramatic, but from something almost routine. A Saturday morning when Daniel told me he had to go into the office for a few hours, something about an urgent issue that could not wait until Monday, and under normal circumstances I would have accepted that without question, but instead of staying home like I usually would, I waited about 20 minutes after he left, then got in my car and followed the route he would normally take, not because I expected to catch him immediately, but because I needed to see if his story held up even in the simplest way, and it did not take long for that to fall apart, because his car was not in the office parking lot, not even close, and for a moment I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, feeling that quiet clarity settle in deeper, not shock, not panic, just confirmation. And instead of driving around looking for him, instead of turning it into something emotional, I went back home, because I already had what I needed. The truth was no longer a question, it was a matter of how much, how far, and how prepared I was going to be before I let him know that I knew. And from that point on, everything I did had a purpose. I started documenting small things, dates, times, inconsistencies, nothing dramatic, just enough to create a timeline that could not be argued with. And I paid closer attention to his habits, the way he dressed differently on certain days, slightly more effort than usual, the way he became more guarded with his schedule, always vague when I asked about his plans. And then there was the name again, Sophie, appearing just enough times for me to recognize it without him ever saying it out loud. And that was when I shifted from observation to intention. Because understanding what was happening was no longer enough, I needed to decide what I was going to do with it, and more importantly, how I was going to do it in a way that left no room for him to twist the narrative, because if there was one thing I knew about Daniel, it was that he would try to explain his way out of anything if given the chance, and I had no intention of giving him that chance, not this time. So instead of confronting him in private, where everything could be minimized or denied, I started thinking about something else entirely, something he would never expect. A situation where the truth would reveal itself without me having to argue for it. A moment where his own choices would expose him more clearly than anything I could ever say. And once that idea took hold, I realized something important. I was no longer reacting to his betrayal, I was designing his consequences. And the only thing left to decide was when and where it would happen, because when it did, it needed to be undeniable. Once I stopped seeing Daniel as someone I needed answers from and started seeing him as someone whose behavior could be studied, everything shifted into place with a kind of precision that almost felt clinical, because emotions cloud judgment but patterns do not, and the more I leaned into that mindset, the easier it became to connect details that would have otherwise seemed unrelated, like the way he started mentioning company events more frequently, casual things at first, a team dinner, a networking mixer, a small celebration for a project milestone, always framed as optional but important enough that he should attend. And at one point he even suggested I come along, which might have seemed like transparency to anyone else, But to me it felt rehearsed, like he was trying to create a version of events where everything appeared normal, and I agreed without hesitation, because the opportunity was exactly what I needed, not just to observe but to confirm everything in a setting where he would be less guarded, because people reveal more when they think they are in control. And a few days later I found the name again, Sophie Bennett, this time not just on his phone but in a company email thread that he had left open on his laptop, something he had become careless about now that he believed I was no longer paying attention. And seeing her full name for the first time did not trigger anger the way I expected it might. Instead it gave me something far more useful, a concrete connection, something I could quietly look into without drawing any attention. And I did not rush it, I did not confront him. I simply let the information sit while I continued watching, because timing was becoming just as important as truth. And then came the event that would change everything. A company gathering held at a restaurant in the city, about 30 minutes from our house, the kind of place with dim lighting and a polished atmosphere. Somewhere people went to celebrate success and build impressions, and Daniel mentioned it casually over dinner one night, saying it would be good for me to meet more of his colleagues, that it had been a while since I joined him at something like that. And I could tell by the way he said it that he believed this was a safe move, that whatever he had been doing existed separately from this part of his life. But what he did not realize was that he had just handed me the perfect setting, a controlled environment where his two worlds would overlap, and I accepted with a calm smile, already knowing that this would not be just another evening out. And in the days leading up to it, I prepared in ways he would never notice, not anything dramatic, just small, deliberate choices. I paid attention to the guest list he mentioned, the timing, the location, the way he described who would be there. And I made sure I understood exactly how the evening would unfold, because if there was going to be a moment where everything came into focus, it needed to happen naturally, without force, without confrontation, something that would make his own actions impossible to deny. And on the night of the event, as we drove into the city, the skyline glowing in the distance and the traffic slowing as we got closer to the restaurant, Daniel seemed completely at ease, making small talk, acting like everything between us was normal, like the past 2 weeks had been just another stretch of routine. And I matched that energy perfectly, responding when necessary, keeping my tone steady, giving him nothing to question, because the last thing I needed was for him to sense anything different. And when we finally pulled into the parking lot and stepped out into the cool evening air, I took a moment to look at the entrance, the soft lighting spilling onto the sidewalk, the faint sound of voices and laughter coming from inside. And I realized something with absolute certainty. This was not just where I would confirm what I already knew. This was where Daniel would unknowingly reveal everything himself, and once he did, there would be no way for him to take it back. The moment we stepped inside, I could feel the shift in Daniel's energy before I even saw her, the way his posture straightened just slightly, the way his attention sharpened as if he was scanning the room for someone specific, and that alone told me more than any message or missed call ever could. Because people do not look for someone unless that person matters, and I stayed just half a step behind him as we moved through the crowd, offering polite smiles, exchanging greetings with people whose names I barely needed to remember, all while watching him far more closely than anyone realized, because this was the first time I was seeing his two worlds collide in real time, and it did not take long, maybe less than a minute after we entered, for it to happen. His gaze locked onto someone across the room, and even before I followed his line of sight, I knew exactly who it would be, Sophie Bennett, standing near the bar, holding a glass in her hand, dressed in a way that was effortlessly put together but intentional enough to stand out, the kind of presence that draws attention without asking for it. And when Daniel saw her, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me because I had been watching for it, that subtle shift from neutral to engaged, from present to focused, and in that instant, everything I had suspected became undeniable. But I did not react, not even a flicker, because this was exactly what I needed, not just confirmation but context. And as we approached the group she was standing with, Daniel introduced me to a few colleagues first, almost as if he was delaying the inevitable, as if part of him was trying to control the timing of that moment. But eventually there was no avoiding it, and when he finally turned toward her, his voice carried a tone I had not heard in weeks, lighter, almost careful, as he said her name. And she responded with a smile that was just a little too familiar for someone who was supposed to be just another coworker. And when her eyes met mine, there was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where something unspoken passed between us, not guilt, not exactly, but awareness, like she already knew who I was without needing to be told. And that told me something else important. This was not a secret to her. not in the way it was supposed to be, and Daniel introduced us with a casual ease that might have convinced anyone else that nothing was out of place, but the details said otherwise. The way he positioned himself slightly closer to her than necessary, the way their conversation flowed too naturally, too comfortably, as if they had already spent more time together than he had ever admitted, and I played my role perfectly, polite, composed, asking the expected questions, responding with just enough engagement to keep everything smooth, because the last thing I needed was to disrupt what was unfolding, and the longer I stood there, the more the pieces aligned, the inside jokes that slipped out too easily, the quick glances they exchanged when they thought no one was paying attention, the subtle shifts in tone when one of them spoke, and I realized something that went beyond simple confirmation. This was not new. This had been going on long enough for them to become comfortable, confident even, and that confidence was exactly what I needed them to have, because confident people make mistakes, they relax their guard, they assume they are safe, and as the evening continued, moving from small conversations to larger group discussions, from introductions to shared stories, I could see Daniel becoming more at ease with each passing minute, as if he had convinced himself that everything was under control, that he had managed to balance both sides of his life without consequence, and Sophie mirrored that ease, stepping into conversations effortlessly, laughing at the right moments, integrating herself into the group in a way that made her presence feel natural, and all of it only reinforced one thing in my mind: they both believed this situation belonged to them, that they were the ones in control of how it would unfold, but what they did not understand, what they could not see yet, was that every word, every glance, every small detail they revealed was not just confirming what I already knew. It was building something much bigger, something they would not be able to walk away from once it reached its conclusion. And as I stood there, calm and completely composed, I knew with absolute certainty that the moment was getting closer, the one where everything would shift, not because I forced it, but because they would create it themselves, exactly the way I needed them to. By the time the night moved into its second hour, the atmosphere had shifted into something more relaxed, conversations growing louder, people settling into smaller circles, and that was when the boundaries Daniel had been trying to maintain started to blur in ways he no longer noticed, because comfort has a way of lowering awareness, and I watched it happen in real time, the distance between him and Sophie becoming smaller, the interactions less guarded, the tone more familiar, and at one point when a few people stepped away from the group, it left just the three of us standing there in a moment that felt almost suspended, like everything else in the room had faded into the background, and that was when I decided to take the next step, not by confronting him but by guiding the situation just enough to let it reveal itself, and I turned slightly towards Sophie, keeping my expression calm, my voice steady, and asked her how long she had been with the company, a simple question, neutral, the kind that did not raise any suspicion. And she answered easily, mentioning a timeline that did not quite align with what Daniel had told me before, and I caught the smallest hesitation in his reaction, just a fraction of a second where he seemed to register the inconsistency. But instead of correcting it, he let it pass, choosing silence over clarification, and that silence said everything, because people only stay quiet when the truth is inconvenient. And I followed with another question, this time about her role, her projects, giving her space to speak, to fill the gaps, and the more she talked, the more comfortable she became, her confidence building with each response, and Daniel, instead of steering the conversation, allowed it to continue, almost as if he trusted that nothing significant would come from it, and that was exactly what I had been counting on, because when people believe they are safe, they stop filtering themselves. And as the conversation continued, she mentioned something specific, a recent late night at the office working on a project with Daniel, phrasing it casually, as if it was just another work detail, but the timing of it overlapped perfectly with a night he had told me he was somewhere else entirely, and I did not react, not outwardly, I simply nodded, letting the information settle into place, another piece of the pattern becoming visible in front of him without him even realizing it, and then I shifted my attention to Daniel just slightly, enough to bring him into the focus of the moment, and asked him to explain the project she was referring to, keeping my tone light, almost curious, and for the first time that evening, he hesitated in a way that was visible, not dramatic, but enough to disrupt the flow he had been maintaining, because now he was being asked to align two versions of the same story in real time, and he chose the easier path. He simplified it, brushed over details, gave an answer that sounded complete on the surface but lacked the substance it needed to hold up. And Sophie, without realizing it, added to that inconsistency by filling in more details that did not quite match his version, and in that moment the dynamic shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but clearly enough to me. because what had been subtle before was now beginning to take shape in a way that could not be ignored, even by him, and I could see it in his expression, the slight tightening, the awareness starting to surface, the realization that something about this interaction was no longer entirely within his control. And that was when I knew the foundation had been set, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through something far more effective, their own words, their own actions, creating a narrative that I did not have to argue against, because it was forming right in front of them. And as the conversation shifted again, other people rejoining, the moment dissolving back into the larger atmosphere of the room, I stepped back just enough to let it breathe, to let him think it had passed, to let him believe he had managed it. But the truth was already in place, layered, undeniable, and all that remained now was the right moment to bring it into full view, because once it surfaced completely, there would be no space left for explanation, no room for interpretation, only the reality he had created for himself, and the consequences that would follow immediately after. As the evening moved closer to its peak, the energy in the room shifted again, louder now, more animated, people gathering near the center where someone had just raised a glass to start an informal toast. And it created the perfect kind of attention, not forced, not staged, but naturally focused, the kind of moment where everyone pauses just long enough to listen. And that was when I knew this was it. Not because I had planned every second, but because the timing aligned in a way that could not have been better, and I stepped slightly forward, positioning myself within that circle of attention without making it obvious, waiting for the right pause, the right opening. And when it came, I did not raise my voice, I did not demand anything, I simply spoke, calm and clear, addressing Daniel directly but loud enough for the people around us to hear, asking him to clarify something simple, something that should have had an easy answer. About the night he said he was working late at the office 2 Saturdays ago. And for a split second everything froze again, not dramatically, but just enough for the shift to be felt, because the question itself was not aggressive, but the context around it made it impossible to ignore. And Daniel's reaction came exactly as I expected, a quick smile, a soft laugh, the kind people use when they think they can smooth something over, and he repeated the same explanation he had given before, about an urgent issue, about needing to be at the office, about things that sounded reasonable until they were placed next to what had already been said earlier that night. And that was when I turned slightly toward Sophie, not accusing, not confronting, just including her in the conversation, asking if that was the same night they had been working together on that project she mentioned. And I watched the realization hit both of them at the same time, subtle but unmistakable, because now the two versions of the story were colliding in a space where neither of them could control the narrative anymore. And Sophie hesitated, just long enough for the silence to stretch, and then she answered carefully, confirming they had worked together that night, adding a detail that made it even clearer, and Daniel's expression shifted in that instant, the confidence slipping just enough to reveal the pressure underneath. Because now he was standing between two truths that could not coexist, and for the first time the people around us began to notice not the full story but the tension, the inconsistency, the way his explanation no longer fit cleanly. And instead of stepping back, instead of letting him recover, I let the moment continue, not by pushing harder, but by asking one more simple question: why he had told me he was somewhere else entirely if he had been with Sophie that night. And this time there was no immediate answer, no smooth transition, just a pause that felt heavier than anything that had come before. And in that pause everything became visible, not just to me, but to anyone paying attention, the disconnect, the hesitation, the lack of a clear response. And that was the moment the dynamic fully shifted, because what had been hidden in small details was now unfolding in plain sight. Not through accusation, but through his own inability to maintain the version of events he had created. And when he finally spoke, his tone had changed, more defensive now, more controlled, as he tried to redirect, to minimize, to suggest that it was all a misunderstanding, that it was not as serious as it sounded. And then he did exactly what I knew he would do when cornered. He turned towards Sophie, subtly but deliberately, aligning himself with her version instead of mine, choosing the easier path, the one that protected him in the moment, even if it cost him everything else. And in doing so he made it clear, not just to me, but to everyone around us, exactly where he stood. And as the room grew quieter, the conversations fading into the background, I felt that same steady calm settle in again, because this was the moment he thought he was regaining control, the moment he believed he had defended his position. But in reality, this was where he had just made the biggest mistake of all, one that he would understand far too late to fix. For a brief moment after Daniel aligned himself with Sophie, there was a sense in the room that things might settle, that his confident tone and controlled explanation could smooth everything over, because that is what people expect in situations like this. that whoever speaks with the most certainty must be telling the truth, and I could see a few of his colleagues beginning to relax, almost ready to accept his version and move on. And that was exactly why I had waited this long, because what came next needed to happen after he fully committed to that choice, after he made it clear where he stood, and I let a quiet second pass before I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just steady, the same calm tone I had maintained all night, and I told him that if that was the version of events he wanted to stand by, then we should probably be clear about everything, not just that one night. And I reached into my bag slowly, not in a dramatic way but deliberately enough that it drew attention, and when I pulled out my phone I did not wave it around or make a scene. I simply held it at a natural angle and unlocked it, because this was not about performance, it was about clarity. And I mentioned almost casually that I had spent the last 2 weeks organizing details, timelines, and records, not because I wanted to catch him, but because I needed to understand the truth without relying on explanations that kept changing. And that was when the shift became undeniable, the confidence in Daniel's expression tightening just slightly, his focus narrowing as he realized this was not something he could talk his way out of. And I continued, explaining that the night he claimed to be at the office, his car had never been there, that I had verified it myself, and that the timing of his messages, the gaps in his schedule, and the details Sophie had just shared all pointed to the same conclusion. And I did not accuse, I did not raise my voice, I simply laid out the facts in a way that left no room for interpretation, and then I added something he had not considered at all, something that shifted the situation beyond just a personal betrayal. I reminded him that the house we lived in, the one he often referred to as ours, had been purchased entirely under my name before our marriage, that the primary financial accounts were structured the same way, something we had agreed on years ago without thinking it would ever matter. And I watched as that realization hit him in real time, because until that moment, he had been focused on defending his image, on maintaining control of the narrative, but now he was beginning to understand the actual consequences, not just emotional but practical, immediate and impossible to ignore. And I could see it in the way his posture shifted, the way his confidence gave way to something more uncertain, more reactive, and Sophie, standing beside him, was no longer as composed as she had been earlier, her expression tightening as she started to understand that this was not just a misunderstanding that could be brushed aside, that this situation had layers she had not been aware of. And I did not need to say much more, because the silence that followed carried everything, the weight of what had just been revealed settling over the group, people no longer looking at this as a simple disagreement, but as something far more serious, something that had been carefully hidden and was now fully exposed. And Daniel tried to respond, of course he did, starting to speak, attempting to redirect again, but this time his words lacked the same certainty, the same control, because the foundation he had been relying on was no longer there. And as I stood there, completely steady, I realized that this was the exact moment everything had shifted, not when I asked the questions, not when he chose Sophie, but right now, when the truth had become undeniable in a way that did not require me to argue it at all. And for the first time that night, Daniel Carter was no longer the one in control of how this story would end. The silence that followed was not chaotic or loud, it was controlled, heavy in a way that made every small movement in the room feel amplified. And I could sense the shift in how people were looking at Daniel now, not with admiration or casual respect, but with quiet judgment, the kind that does not need words to be understood. And for the first time that night, he did not have an immediate response, no smooth explanation, no confident redirection, just a pause that stretched longer than he could manage. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the ease it carried before, replaced with something uncertain, something trying to recover ground that was already gone, and he attempted to minimize everything again, to suggest that it had been misinterpreted, that it was not what it looked like. But the difference now was that no one was leaning in to believe him, because the clarity of the situation had already settled, and I did not interrupt him, I did not argue, I simply let him speak until his own words began to lose structure, because sometimes the most effective response is allowing someone to reveal how little control they actually have. And when he finally stopped, I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he had said everything he could, and then I spoke one last time, calm and direct, explaining that I was not there to debate or to create a scene, that everything I needed to understand had already been made clear, and that moving forward I would be making decisions based on facts, not explanations. And I could see the realization settling in deeper, not just about what had happened between us, but about what would come next, because this was no longer a private issue that could be handled quietly behind closed doors. It had unfolded in front of people who now understood exactly what kind of choices he had made, And that kind of awareness does not disappear, it follows you, it reshapes how you are seen, how you are trusted, how you are spoken about when you are not in the room, and that was something he could not undo, no matter how much he tried. And Sophie, who had been standing beside him through all of this, was no longer as steady as she had been at the beginning of the night, her confidence replaced with a visible discomfort, because whatever version of this situation she had imagined, it had clearly not included this outcome. And without needing to say anything to her directly, it was obvious that she now understood the position she had stepped into, not one of quiet control or hidden advantage, but one of exposure. And that was not something either of them had prepared for. And as I looked at Daniel one last time, I realized there was nothing left for me to take from this moment. No need for further explanation, no need for closure in the way people often expect, because closure had already happened the moment the truth became undeniable. And with that, I reached for my bag, adjusted it over my shoulder, and turned toward the exit without hesitation, not rushing, not looking back, just walking with the same steady composure I had maintained all night. And as I moved through the room, I could feel the weight of what had just unfolded lingering behind me. Conversations still paused, people still processing, and I did not need to hear what they would say after I left to understand the impact, because some moments speak for themselves long after they are over. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights stretching out in front of me, I took a slow breath, not out of relief but out of clarity, because what I had just walked away from was not a loss, it was a release from something that no longer held value. And while Daniel remained inside, dealing with the consequences he had created in a matter of minutes, I moved forward knowing that everything ahead of me was now entirely within my control, and that was something he had already lost the moment he chose to stand where he did.